Okay, so today we're going to dive into something pretty stark that's being talked about in the crypto world. This idea of a crypto crime supercycle. It's a term that, well, it suggests things are escalating quite a bit.
It really is a striking phrase, isn't it? A supercycle.
Yeah.
And uh, our goal here in this deep dive is really to unpack what might be driving this reported surge.
Yeah, exactly. Why are people calling it that? What makes it a supercycle and not just, the usual ups and downs?
Right. It implies something more sustained, maybe more systemic,
Mm.
driven by some underlying factors. We want to figure out what those might be and what it means for digital assets overall.
And for this, we're drawing on some really sharp analysis. We've got insights from well-known blockchain investigators like ZachXBT and Taylor Monahan.
hmm And we're also looking at, hard numbers from cybersecurity firm Hackin, plus some reports from the U.S. Department of Justice.
So the big question really is, what's actually fueling this thing? And why is this term supercycle popping up right now?
Well, the core argument seems to stem from ZachXBT. He's basically saying, look, crypto has always had issues with abuse. That's not new.
Sure.
But he believes the situation now has noticeably increased.
Noticeably increased. That's
So,
interesting phrasing. Not explosive, but significant. What does he point to? What are the drivers, according to him?
he's quite direct, actually. He points fingers at political figures launching meme coins. He specifically mentions Donald Trump as an example.
Okay, that's one piece.
And crucially, he also highlights U.S. regulators apparently dropping some crypto-related court cases. He sees these things as enabling factors.
That's a pretty strong connection he's making there. How does he argue that, say, a politician launching a coin or regulators backing off a case, how does that lead to more crime?
The consequence he lays out is this. He claims crypto influencers and what he calls key thought leaders are facing zero repercussions for scamming their followers.
Ah, okay, so it's about accountability. Or the lack of it.
Precisely. He suggests this creates a kind of environment, maybe a perception, that you can get away with this stuff, like a green light for bad actors.
And he had some thoughts on the regulators' focus, too, didn't he? A critique.
Yeah, quite a sharp one. He basically argues that if regulators had focused their energy differently, on actually regulating the space to prevent scams, instead of, as he puts it, going after open source developers or blue chip decentralized protocols, he thinks the crime is so widespread because there haven't really been consequences.
Right. Only prevalent because there's never really been repercussions. That's a powerful claim about where regulatory attention has or maybe hasn't been.
And if you follow that logic, the lack of repercussions,
Let's hear it.
well, it leads to the next point, doesn't it? Why would scammers stop if it's working so well for them?
Which brings us to Taylor Monahan's perspective.
Exactly. She really hammers home the financial incentive. She says scammers are unlikely to change because they're just rewarded through large profits.
She paints a pretty bleak picture. She says there are essentially no social, financial, or legal downsides or friction for this kind of behavior.
Yeah.
So easy and there's so much instant money on the table. It sounds almost like a perfect setup for criminals. Is it really that frictionless, though?
Well, from their perspective, her analysis suggests it largely is. And connecting that to the wider ecosystem, she feels crypto is in a rough spot.
Oh, a rough spot
Because it's, in her words, retaining too many hackers and scammers. She points out that these actors have specialized over time. They've gone basically all in on certain activities across different market cycles.
And she gave examples, right? Like specific types of scams.
Yeah, really concerning ones. Romance scams, which are just awful. Activities linked to North Korea. Even things like malware as a service.
Malware as a service. Wow! That shows a level of organization, doesn't it? It's not just opportunistic stuff.
Not at all. And she made this really striking comment. Ransomware would be the biggest losers if crypto ceased to exist tomorrow.
That really highlights how fundamental crypto has become for certain types of crime. It's not just facilitating, it's almost essential infrastructure for them.
So, okay, we've talked about the drivers, the incentives.
Yeah.
But what's the scale? How bad is it in, dollar terms?
Yeah, the numbers are where it gets really sobering. Hackin, the cybersecurity firm, put out a report in April covering the first quarter of 2025.
Yeah.
Over $2 billion lost just to crypto hacks in 3 months.
$2 billion. That's enormous.
It is. And that's just hacks. They also broke down other types. Phishing scams accounted for about $96 million.
Okay. Still a huge amount.
And Rugpulls, where developers just vanish with the money those cost investors over $300 million.
Yeah.
It just shows how many different ways people are losing money.
It paints a pretty grim picture of the vulnerabilities.
Mm.
But is it all just, criminals getting away with it? Is anyone fighting back?
Well, yeah, it's important to balance this. Law enforcement is having some successes. It's not like nothing is happening.
Okay, like what?
The U.S. Department of Justice, for instance, recently announced a pretty big seizure by the Secret Service. They recovered over $225 million connected to crypto investment scams.
$225 million back. That's significant.
Definitely. And it's not just the U.S. There was an arrest in May over in New Zealand.
Oh, yeah.
A guy linked to a global crypto fraud operation. They allege he stole something like 450 million New Zealand dollars.
Which is roughly
About 265 million U.S. dollars. So yes, the problem's massive and maybe growing, but there are definitely counter efforts making dents.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together. What we've heard in this deep dive is that experts like ZachXBT and Taylor Monahan are pointing to a few key things driving this potential crime supercycle.
Right. It seems to be a mix. You've got perceived weak regulation, or at least misdirected regulation, according to ZachXBT.
Mm-hmm. Then there's the role of things like political figures endorsing risky assets, like meme coins.
And just the sheer profit involved, as Monahan highlighted. It's easy money for scammers, often without immediate consequences.
Yeah, that lack of consistent repercussions seems key. But as you said, it's not a totally one-sided story.
No, definitely not. We're seeing law enforcement agencies around the world score some pretty major wins, seizing huge amounts of stolen funds. So, the fight is ongoing.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with something to think about, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, given how fast this whole digital finance world is changing, and how sophisticated both the good guys and the bad guys are getting,
Right.
what's next? What new kinds of digital crime might we see? Or maybe more hopefully, what new ways to prevent it might emerge? And how are we all, individuals, regulators, going to keep up?
That's a really important question, isn't it? How do we adapt? It's definitely a lot to consider as this space keeps evolving. Hopefully, this deep dive gave you a clearer view of the complex picture around crypto crime right now. Thanks for joining us.